This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Shawn Levy, who I need to introduce with a slight story, an anecdote. 25 years ago I came to Italy and it was the first time I'd ever flown, and in order to get to Italy from London I had to stay overnight at Stansted Airport because it was only early morning flights. And these were the days when I was a student. I had no money. So I decided I'm going to sit up in the airport. And all I had for company was a book called Rat Pack Confidential. And I read that book cover to cover, and it was an amazing piece of company. It kept me fully awake when my flight was called. It was like, oh, brilliant. So thank you, Shawn, for accompanying me on my first ever flight.
Whatever it takes to sell a book, I'm very happy.
But I've read your work for many years, Shawn. As you can tell, I started 2025. Actually, that was 1999. So, woof, that's 26 years ago.
Yeah, that book was published in late 98 in the UK.
Yeah, and I had like an airport edition. You know how those sort of bigger editions that you get from the airport. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of how you got into writing and maybe your background with that book in particular?
You know, I have been writing sort of journalism, mainly film criticism, but also just journalism since elementary school, truly. And worked on the middle school newspaper, editor of the high school newspaper, worked on newspapers in college. I have a master's of fine arts degree in poetry, which is still a very lively pursuit of mine, a vital pursuit. I read a lot of poetry. I published a book of poems a few years ago. And I thought I would go to grad school and become a professor of poetry somewhere, perhaps in Italy. I learned Italian in graduate school. And instead, I wound up becoming a dad. My little family and I formed in Southern California. And I looked in the newspaper every day for jobs under writer and editor. And I found a job at a film magazine, and it was perfect. And I parlayed that into a second job. That magazine went under. My family moved to Portland, Oregon, where I've lived since 1992. I crossed the Oregon border with everything we needed strapped to our station wagon and all of our money in the world in traveler's checks in my pocket. And I passed the sign that said, "Welcome to Oregon." And I thought, if I could be film critic of the Oregonian, the state's big daily newspaper, and write books, I would have it made. And if I had known they were actually listening to me that day, I would have suggested something about money. But in fact, that was the beginning of my career. Within a couple of years, I was the film critic at the daily newspaper, and I published my first book, which was a biography of Jerry Lewis in 1996. So really, I'm doing what I've always wanted to do, which strikes me as extremely fortunate.
It sounds like a blessed. I mean, in a way, it's a sort of lost age as well. That idea of becoming a film critic for a daily newspaper and magazines and such as those. We're sort of seeing that on the wane, tragically.
I caught sort of the last high wave of that form of our hard media at the Oregonian. When I started writing for them in 1992, Oregon is not a very populous state, and our daily newspaper had a Sunday circulation of more than 400,000. And we know from back in those days that newspapers would not, 300,000 or 400,000 newspapers would be read by 1.5 million people because the whole household would have access to it, or someone would leave it at the barber shop or the diner, and people would pick it up through. So you had many, many readers, and that can happen online as well. The difference, I believe, is that it's so balkanized and diffuse now. I don't believe any two people look at the same diet of digital media. And back in the day, the state's daily newspaper, the few national newspapers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, would kind of be the foundation for other conversations. I don't believe that's the case anymore, and I'm lucky to have experienced it. On the other hand, I experienced the dwindling. By the time I left the Oregonian on my own 2 feet, I wasn't downsized. I walked away. In 2012, my compensation was 3/4 of what it had been when I signed on to the paper. And I was being asked to cover, in addition to the film beat, another beat. I happen to be a social media and sort of personal tech buff. And Portland is a great tech hub. So I was able to do more work than that. But basically, I was doing 1.5 times the work for 3/4 the pay by the end.
Yeah, that's unfortunately feels very typical, and today it's only got worse, I'm afraid to say. Jerry Lewis, though, has been one of those figures in American culture that I've tried to penetrate. I've tried to acquire a taste of, without fully succeeding, I have to say. I recently watched Artists and Models at the Bologna Film Festival, the Cinema Ritrovato Film Festival, and I really enjoyed it. But I kind of really enjoyed everyone around Jerry Lewis.
Yeah, Jerry's a particular taste. He's like Durain or capers. Some people will not order the dish if those elements are in it. And I can't say that I went into it having a taste for Jerry Lewis so much as having an awareness of the cultural weight of him. I grew up in a household in New York City where the Jerry Lewis annual muscular dystrophy telethon held during the bank holiday weekend at the end of summer was sort of like Passover or Christmas. It was like a big deal. My parents were old-time showbiz fans, and Jerry in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up would have the likes of Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet, Lena Horne, the sort of pantheon figures of mid-century American singing and show business. And when I came to write books, I realized when the idea of Jerry Lewis popped into my head, I thought, well, I know 7 interesting things about this guy. His roots in the Borscht Belt as a comedian, his reliance on this weird physical comedy, his relationship with Dean Martin, his reputation as an auteur, and directing his own films well before other actors regularly did that. And then the demise of his career and his crazy Clown in the Concentration Camp movie and the Martin Scorsese film in which he plays a very Jerry Lewis-like character, and this guy on the telethon who became slick and Vegasy and angry. So I knew like there was a good story to tell, and his work was something I had to go through in order to tell that story. There are films of his I like and I recommend, but they're a small portion of his total output.
Yeah, because he made an incredible number of films as well. He had an incredible number of of things to see. And talking of which, because I'd love to talk about Rat Pack Confidential and Paul Newman and all the other work that you've done, and La Dolce Vita, the book that you wrote about the film industry in Italy in the 50s and 60s. But we should get on to Clint, because I feel that Clint Eastwood is such a big topic as well that even with an hour, we're probably not gonna cover him. What a mammoth topic.
Yeah, Clint Eastwood. So my latest book, Clint, the Man in the Movies, is, I mean, I always say when you're writing a book, you need to find a hole in the bookshelf. There needs to be nothing about this subject, or the most recent work on this subject has to be old enough that there's a new take or new material to write about, because otherwise you're just sort of following someone else's footsteps. And in the case of Clint Eastwood, there's really a small bookcase of books about him. There's a couple I make reference to. One is called Clint fucking Eastwood. It's a French book. One is a book called Clint Eastwood Sexual Cowboy, published in the UK in the 70s or early 80s. I'm not a huge fan of the book, but kudos for that title. And there are two major biographies of Clint Eastwood, one by Richard Schickel and one by Patrick McGilligan. The Schickel is very fawning. It was done with Clint's complete cooperation. Schickel, the longtime critic for Time magazine, and he was on the set of Unforgiven, and he made a sort of a promotional film about the making of Unforgiven, and their relationship resulted in a book-length interview, basically. And McGilligan's book came out a couple years later, and it's in the vein of a Kitty Kelly book, in that it focuses so much on the wrongdoing, the poor choices, the pettinesses of the subject, that you think, why would you write this book? I did not care for Jerry Lewis as a human being, and that guy lived in my head for 2 to 3 years, and it was awful. And to choose to write a book about someone you can't stand is a big choice. And when I first decided that Clint Eastwood would be a good subject, I felt that these two books they're both very well made. The Schickel is very intimate, close up to Clint, and the McGilligan, the guy's a fantastic researcher. So there was sort of nothing he left unturned, I believed. I thought they cover everything. There's nothing here for me to do, even though the books are 25 years old. But it turned out that they're so opposed to one another, sort of dogmatically about who Clint Eastwood is, that there was actually a wide avenue right between them that I could walk down and say, oh, I don't have to be on Clint's side, and I don't have to hate Clint. I can come to each event, spot check details on these books, make sure I've got dates right, or did this really happen? What does he say? What does he say? And do my own thing. And it struck me that the essential fact about Clint Eastwood is that he makes movies. He started directing in 1971. He released a film last year at the age of 94 as a producer and director. He started acting in 1954. His most recent screen appearance was in 2021. So we've got a 50-plus year directing career, a 70-year acting career. Nobody in the history of Hollywood has ever done both of those things, and at a very high level. Only John Wayne has ever appeared in the year-end box office top 10 list of stars more times than Clint Eastwood, and Clint was number one more frequently than John Wayne. And as a director, he's directed 2 Best Pictures and won 2 Best Director Oscars, which is more than you can say for his contemporaries, Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese. So there's a story there, and if you just tell the story in the plainest way, you have a book, because he also has a career in politics, a career in sports, a career in business. He owns Pebble Beach golf links. I didn't know that going in. I didn't know that the guy who directed Sully with Tom Hanks survived a forced water landing of an aircraft when he was in the military as like a 22-year-old and crashed into the Pacific and swam to shore. Then 50 odd years later, he makes a movie about that airliner that was landed in the Hudson River. So the stories would just add up simply by virtue of there being so many of them, and you wind up with a book, much like Jerry Lewis. I knew there was a book in Clint. It was just a question of, was there room for mine on the bookcase? And it turned out that there was.
I think that was a really interesting choice, because I thought the danger of any, and I've read both Patrick McGilligan and Richard Schickel's books, and I think McGilligan's is very funny, as well as being, it has the scurrilousness and the details and what have you, but it's sort of within that there are so many bits which make me laugh, like being in the company of a very well-informed gossip. But I actually thought, when I was beginning yours, I was thinking, oh my God, how are you going to do this, just because of the number of films? And I think that is a really interesting point that you make, that the actual number of films isn't the bug, it's the feature of the biography.
Yeah, that's why I call it the man in the movies. So Clint is an obvious title. You don't have many people you can get away with a 5-letter word and everyone knows who it is. That he gets up every morning in his 90s to work. And I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, but I'm told that he's reading scripts right now at age 95, looking to make another feature. Because there's nothing valedictory about the movie he released last year, Juror Number 2. It's a tight little courtroom drama. It gives the vibe of 12 Angry Men. It's a very interesting film, and yet consistent with his work in that it's about the cost of an act of violence on the soul of the person who perpetuates it. And this has been a theme of his since at least the mid-'80s. And I would argue, if you look at The Man with No Name and Dirty Harry, who are meant to be these merciless killing machines, you wouldn't want to be those guys. There's some damage in them. The violence that they're able to commit has come at the cost of human connection, of being, able to feel emotions, of being able to experience joy. It's very clear that those guys have lived hard pasts, and I wouldn't want to be Dirty Harry Callahan. So yeah, I think this is an interesting thing, and it's all in his movies. And he's woven aspects of his life into movies. There are stories of fathers trying to make amends for being absent to their daughters. There's the love of jazz music, which features in the scores of his movies, but also I would say is an aspect of the way he makes movies. He relies on first takes. He relies on working with the same crew for decades. So it's sort of like Duke Ellington keeping his band together, paying them really good salaries so they wouldn't run off. And then he knew, okay, this guy can play this riff and this guy has this sound. I'm going to put it over here. And Clint is like that. He worked with people basically until they retired or died. And he's the same way. He will make movies until he can't get out of bed to make movies. And as far as I know, he's still ambulatory.
There is a real sense throughout his career as well of him defying everyone else's expectations about him. He comes to success pretty late. The TV show, which is originally his breakthrough with Rawhide, he's playing, Second Banana, and the TV show itself is sort of stutters. It stutters along, and he still hasn't broken through into movie. So that all the time, and then of course, as you relate, you have the Sergio Leone westerns. I totally agree with what you just said as well. There's those moments of tenderness throughout those westerns, whether it's him talking to Marisol about I knew someone who was in trouble, or sharing the cigar with the dying soldier. There's this wonderful. Just these delicate moments of tenderness, in the midst of this beautiful opera of violence, it has to be said. But that coming to success late, could that be part of the reason that spurs him to be so, he feels like he's got to make up for lost time?
Yeah, I believe so. Rawhide begins shooting in 1959. And he was ready to leave movies. He starred in what he called the worst Western ever made, and it's called Ambush at Cimarron Pass. And I'm going to say it's in the conversation for worst Western ever made. Certainly worse that I've watched from beginning to end. It was so cheaply made that they could only rent horses for one day, so they had to write into the script a narrative about the native tribe that they were at war with stealing their horses. Like that explains why they're walking. And he was at that time he was on his fifth or sixth agent. He had been cut loose from the Universal Acting School where he really got his start. He was playing bit parts on TV, one-off shots on episodic programs, often westerns or military dramas. He was digging swimming pools like with a shovel in backyards in Southern California to make a living when he got the job on Rawhide. But he was 30 when that show debuted, or just about on the eve of his 30th birthday. And he had already been kicked in the teeth for a number of years trying to break into the business. And he makes 217 episodes of Rawhide. He's not in every single one because it was this sort of episodic thing, and sometimes it would wander off and follow one of the other characters for an hour. But if you take those 217 hours and ascribe them to him, that's probably more time than he's on screen for the entire rest of his career. If he makes 70 movies, they're not all 3 hours.
Right.
So that's remarkable. He had a whole career before he ever starred in a movie. And he goes to Italy for $15,000, granted 1964 money, but still. And he makes a Western for an Italian director shot in Spain. He's the only guy on set who speaks English. And he thought, well, it's a paid vacation in Europe and no one back home will ever see it. And it's 3 years and 3 movies before that trilogy airs in the United States. And as soon as it shows up in February of 1967, he's a movie star. And again, now he's in his mid-30s. People have been laughing at him. You went over to Italy to make a Western? Ha, ha, ha. And the first thing he does is form his own film company, Malpaso, which is still his film company 57, 58 years later. And he starts producing for himself, and he with the aim of directing, because he felt like, I have not been a star. I am barely a star. I might wake up not a star again next week. I'm going to learn other ways to be in this business. So I'm going to learn how to produce, and I'm going to learn how to direct. And he didn't know Dirty Harry was coming and would make him an even bigger star. And he didn't know he'd have a 20-odd, 30-year-odd run at the top of the box office. And he kept directing movies because he was like, the more I know how to do this, the less likely it is that I'll wake up one day with no job. So I think late coming success is important to understanding the psyche of this kid. This kid, I call him, because I think of him often as a kid who grew up in the Depression, and his family moved around a lot. He was privileged later. His family had a swimming pool in the yard when he was in high school, but those early, years of relative privation stuck.
Yeah, it taught him resilience and resourcefulness and independence. I mean, one of the facts that I didn't know until I read your book was the idea that he didn't see Fistful of Dollars until they were trying to persuade him to make the sequel.
Yeah, you couldn't see it in the United States because they were under the threat of legal action by the Japanese creators of Yojimbo, whose plot they had stole whole cloth, which is ironic because Yojimbo is stolen whole cloth from Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest, and he doesn't get any credit for it. He didn't have any commercial credit for it. So he thought, well, I had this crazy adventure and that's over. And then they came back. They had changed the title of the film. When he filmed it, it was called The Mysterious Stranger. He had met Sergio Leone, but Sergio Leone had been working, he's credited on the original cuts of the film as Robert Robertson. So there's a movie called A Fistful of Dollars by Robert Robertson making a lot of money in Europe, but Clint doesn't know that's his movie. And then they rang him up and said, please do another. And he was like, can I see the first before I agree? And, he had never been on an Italian film set, so he didn't know that all the dialogue would be recorded in post. He didn't understand that, they could do things in Italian cinema that the Hollywood production code wouldn't allow, like putting the person doing the shooting and the person hit by the bullet in the same frame, showing blood after a gunshot. All these little choices that are sort of the genius of Sergio Leone were impossible to imagine for someone schooled on 217 episodes of Rawhide, which were about as cornflakes as you could get.
Absolutely. And along with Sergio Leone, his other sort of mentor when it came to directors was, of course, Don Siegel, who comes into his world and sort of maybe I think that the sense I got from your book was that he sort of influences in him in the sort of running and gunning sort of method of filmmaking.
Siegel, pardon me, Siegel is a classic Hollywood B-movie director whose movies are much better than the budgets or the promotion or the attention they got from the studio. Riot and Cell Block 11, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, these genre pictures that were much more interesting than the studio knew. And he had come up in a funny way. He learned to make movies by creating montages for classic films. So we've all seen a Don Siegel movie, even if we've never seen one, because the opening of Casablanca that shows the montage of how people arrive in Casablanca desperate to get to Lisbon is created by Don Siegel and tacked into Michael Curtiz's finished film. He had three great mentors, Sergio Leone being one, an acting coach named Jack Coslin, whom he met at Universal, who taught Clint a precept that sounds like a joke, but is in fact very wise. Don't just do something, stand there. Because Clint came up in the era of Brando and Dean and Montgomery Clift and Paul Newman and Ben Gazzara, the great method actors, and everyone was trying to emote. And that did not come naturally to Clint, but he could harness his energy and focus it in stillness. That suited him. He was a loner. So that lesson from Coslin dovetails nicely with the way Siegel made movies. We know what we're going to shoot when we turn off the camera at night. We know what the next shot's going to be the next morning. We're going to execute it. If we do 3 or 4 takes, we're wasting time and money, and something is wrong. It's not, oh, we're going to get it right. It's like, no, we have the wrong idea going in. And that philosophy is Clint's philosophy to this day. And Siegel also taught him just like how to stay under the radar of the studios. Siegel had worked at Warner Brothers, at Universal, at Paramount, at RKO. And when he worked with Clint, they were at Universal and then Warner Brothers. And Siegel just knew, like, say yes, and then do what you want. If you're on time and under budget, they're not going to ask questions. And that's Clint's philosophy. Malpaso, his company, has basically functioned as an independent company, whether at Universal or at Warner Brothers, where it's been since 1975, much in the way that Steven Soderbergh has his own production company, or Quentin Tarantino produces under his own shingle. And it's been a handshake deal with Warner Brothers. They understand that Warner Brothers will provide the production funds. Clint will shoot the movie. He will hand it to Warner Brothers finished, and they will promote it and distribute it, and he will get, some portion of the proceeds. And the deal works out financially for him because he's a producer independently. It works out for them because there's a great line from one of the Warner Brothers executives. He spends our money as if it were his own, meaning he's frugal. There was a nickname for him around Warner Brothers, Skin Clint, because he was known to be very cheap, even to the point of always needing extra wooden hangers in his office because he was taking them home. This is a guy worth 9 figures, and he's stealing office supplies and hangers. So, he learned from two guys. There's a great Sergio Leone story, and I don't believe I put it in the book, but one night he and his wife had two daughters, and he's trying to get them to bed. The wife is trying to get them to bed, and she's not having any luck. And she says, Sergio, please go in and tell them a story. And it starts to get quiet in their room. So she peeks in, and Sergio Leone is telling his two daughters, and finally, never put your own money in a movie. And Clint learned that lesson.
I mean, there's a superb quote in your book as well of Clint doesn't make deals, he makes movies.
But it's true. It's true. Clint, there's stories in there of like somebody hands in a script and they don't hear back from Clint. And then they hear back from Clint and they think, oh, great, I'm going to get the notes. I'm going to do the rewrite. And Clint's like, no, we're shooting already. I want to hire you for the next movie. Or Peter Morgan, the great Peter Morgan, wrote a movie, Afterlife, which Clint, fell heir to after Steven Spielberg had Morgan go through 3 or 4 drafts. And he said, we've messed this up. I want to take the first draft and give it to my friend Clint. And Morgan's like, great. And according to Morgan, the next thing he heard was that they were casting and going ahead with his first draft. And again, writers have that experience with Clint. He has them make changes, and then they see the finished film, and the changes are gone. And Clint's like, you know what? I want to make the film that caught my eye, not some version of it that we've hashed out in conferences.
Which I was going to say, it goes so much against sort of what you expect from a modern day studio process of everything being sort of tested and everyone having to give notes. And, I mean, I've been told as a scriptwriter, oh, you have to write 3 different scripts, one to sell it, one to make the movie, one to edit it, or one to cast it, for instance. Just going back for a second, we mentioned Dirty Harry, and we've already mentioned The Man with No Name. Dirty Harry is really one of those creations that Eastwood comes up with with Don Siegel that cement his persona. I mean, we've seen sort of Coogan's Bluff, and we've seen sort of ideas of where Clint might go with this, but Harry Callahan sort of has that solid persistence, and he's going to make a whole bunch of sequels afterwards. Could you talk a little bit about how Harry Callahan sort of weaves into the myth of Clint Eastwood and how that goes with his career through into the 80s?
Yes, 1971 is a very crucial year for him. He's making his first film as a director, Play Misty for Me, which is a fascinating movie and holds up really well. There's a couple of things that feel a little too, anachronistic, some of the sexual politics, but not much, because the guy's a jerk and he gets what's coming to him. It's if you don't know nothing about the movie, understand that Fatal Attraction has a very similar storyline. A man philanders, and the woman whom he thinks he can dispose of doesn't feel that way, and she's got she's not getting the care she needs, and she sort of goes after him in criminal ways. And that same year, he stars as Harry Callahan for Don Siegel. In fact, in the famous "Are You Feeling Lucky" punk scene, there's a movie theater in the background, and you can see on the movie marquee it says "Play Misty for Me," which hadn't yet appeared in theaters at the time they shot. So those 2 films, he begins as a director, but he also has a character who is not a cowboy, although it's very much like a Western sheriff character. It's modern dress. He's involved in modern sort of social and political tropes that the Dirty Harry series, which is 5 films over 16 or 18 years, is constantly trying to be present in the here and now. The sexual politics, the politics around law enforcement, the cultural events of the day. In the very last Dirty Harry movie, the members of Guns N' Roses appear as a kind of trashy post-punk metal band. They don't have any lines, but they're in the scenes. And that's fascinating.
To the concertinaing of time, yeah.
Yeah. But, Dirty Harry also, because he's in modern dress and not not riding a horse, and set in the 19th century feels like the gauntlet is being thrown down about, the rights of criminals to equal treatment under the law, the rights of victims to be recognized as and to have justice spoken in their names, law enforcement using excessive force or appropriate force depending on the situation or how you see it. And Clint didn't like to talk about his politics, but he was one of the few Republicans in Hollywood. And I think that that became conflated with his screen image. Oh, he's Dirty Harry and he supported Richard Nixon. He's a fascist. And, great writers. Roger Ebert, Pauline Kael kind of went after Dirty Harry and Clint Eastwood ad hominem based on that. I think that in the heat of the moment, I can understand why they would take the positions they did. I think when you look at Clint's body of work as a director and his life as a public figure, as a political figure, he's much more moderate than Harry Callahan. It's scary that he can play him so well, but also note that there are 5 Dirty Harry movies and he only directed one, and that was the one his girlfriend brought to him as a star vehicle for herself. And so he kept Dirty Harry sort of at the end of a long fork. And you might roast a marshmallow at a campfire. He understood these are projects I do for Warner Brothers, so that when I want to come to them with Bird or A Perfect World or White Hunter Black Heart, really personal projects, they won't say no because I'm making them billions.
I mean, that's again, it's sort of like invents, as we've already sort of established, the idea of your own shingle. Now any star who has 3 movie hits has their own production company. Similarly, anyone who wants to have a career in Hollywood at the top level sort of has to get themselves a franchise. Tom Cruise has to have Mission Impossible. Matt Damon has to have the Bourne films in order to parlay that into making perhaps more interesting movies, perhaps more, one for me, one for the studio. In the case of Tom Cruise, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but a lot of actors are doing that with superhero movies now. So it seems like Clint Eastwood was kind of doing that right at the beginning, where he was using Dirty Harry partly to talk about topical issues, but also keep the studios happy and let me do something else, as you suggested.
Yeah, and he made efforts to create a third franchise character. He had the 2 Philo Beto films, Every Which Way But Loose and Any Which Way You Can, and they are dreadful. I know people loved him when they saw him repeatedly on cable when they were kids, but I came to them. I was in college when those films came out. I was not going to see those movies. I was trying to see, like last year at Marienbad and 8 and a Half, and these movies were anathema to me, and I finally had to watch them when I wrote this book, and they are dreadful. If you come to them for the first time in the 2020s, there's no charm in watching. It's charming to watch Clint play loosey-goosey, and even mock his tough guy persona by being a kind of dimwit whose best chum is an orangutan. But you get that from the poster. You don't have to sit and watch the whole damn thing. And I will point out that he didn't direct those 2 either, and he only went to that well twice. And he quickly realized, I do not want to make any more of these. I don't care if they're profitable. He tried to create a franchise with a series of Tom Clancy-ish thrillers, starting with a movie called Firefox about a high-end U.S. pilot who had gone off to live in the wilderness and was brought back to steal an experimental jet from the Russians. And that movie was kind of creaky and poorly made, and the timing was wrong. It came out around the time of Star Wars and Top Gun, and even though he used great effects people, Clint is not a director of that kind of spectacle. So there were a lot of shots of a guy in a cockpit by himself, bracing. It was poorly received and appropriately so. So I think
Thinking Russian.
Yeah, yeah. He became his own franchise, really. Sort of the way Arnold Schwarzenegger, he had the Terminator movies, but when you went to see an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, you were getting something. And Clint was that guy, a true Hollywood iconic personality actor.
And yet at the same time, I remember because I had my relationship with Clint Eastwood was, as you say, the Right Turn Clyde films I watched when I was a kid. Where Eagles Dare was a family favorite. Coming from Britain, that's like you get injected with that film.
Much more beloved in the UK than in the US. I was stunned to find Jeffrey Dyer, of all people, had written a monograph on Where Eagles Dare. This like John Updike's yeah, John Updike's book on A Night at the Opera. It's just like...
Following my sort of timeline of watching Clint and growing up with him, sort of being there in the 80s and the 90s, I remember thinking no one would have put. I think you make this example in the book as well. I would never have put money on Clint Eastwood of Firefox and Right Turn Clyde, then making White Hunter Black Heart, or then making Bird, or even when I went back and watched Honky Tonk Man or Bronco Billy, or there was so much more complex there. There was so much more nuance that I'd missed.
Yeah, he starts making really personal movies. I mean, his handful of first movies, Play Misty for Me. People were like, "What? You're playing a disc jockey, and the woman has the big part." And then he made Breezy, which he doesn't appear in except for sort of a Hitchcockian cameo where he's stood on a boardwalk and you can see him, but he has no lines or business. He's just there, which is a story of a middle-aged man falling in love with a kind of manic pixie dream girl, hippie girl. He makes a Leone-esque Western, High Plains Drifter. He makes the Eiger Sanction. So he's constantly looking for ways to do something different. The Eiger Sanction is a story about mountain climbers, and he learned to climb, and he climbed the Eiger in part during the film. He's constantly looking for ways to do something that's interesting to him in the moment, and he goes through phases. So in the 80s, he makes 4 interesting films about artists: Bronco Billy, Honky Tonk Man, Bird, White Hunter, Black Heart. More recently, he's made a bunch of films about people who run afoul of the law in some way that's unjustified, and they are actually heroic. So Sully, even though it's about the heroic landing of the plane and all the lives being preserved, concentrates mainly on the investigation into whether or not he could have saved the aircraft. Richard Jewell, a film about a guy who was wrongly accused of setting the bomb in the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. The 1517 to Paris, an experimental film in which he cast the 3 young men who foiled a terrorist on a train going from Amsterdam to Paris in the early aughts. He cast them as themselves in a movie that takes only about 80 minutes, half of which is dedicated to a real-time reenactment of this traumatic thing that had happened to these very fellows. So, like, that theme interests him these days. And you don't know with him. You don't know what's he going to get onto next. He did a period of time where he was adapting, crime thrillers, Absolute Power, Blood Work, True Crime. So, he moves from interest to interest. And, other directors do this, but they're not prolific the way he is. And of course, they're not starring in the films as well. It's a truly singular career. In the New York Times review, A.O. Scott, who's not a friend of mine and doesn't owe me money, had all these nice things to say. And one of the things he points out is it's as if John Ford were also John Wayne or Steven Spielberg were also Tom Cruise. That's the career we're looking at.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good comparison. Yeah, I mean, because we've talked about all of these movies. We've between us named classics that anybody would be proud of, and we still haven't talked about Unforgiven, Million Dollar Baby, and Mystic River,
Yeah, yeah.
and all Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima.
Yeah, I want to point out there are two streaks here. So he makes Unforgiven, he's like 62. He follows that with one of his best acting jobs in the Line of Fire, directed by Wolfgang Petersen, which was presented to him as a project to direct, and he said, no, I'll just act. He follows that with A Perfect World, which is a fantastic, if I have to pick a deep cut Clint Eastwood movie, I always point people to that one with Kevin Costner as a bad guy, an escaped convict, a killer, and Clint Eastwood trying to chase him down in the weeks prior to John Kennedy's assassination. And he follows that with The Bridges of Madison County, where he goes toe to toe with the greatest actor of our era, Meryl Streep, scene for scene with her. And it's a terrific love story. Again, something you wouldn't expect Clint Eastwood to do. Fast forward about 6 years, he makes Mystic River again. Someone's telling you, I'm making a crime drama about a tragic killing in Boston. Who are you thinking? Michael Mann, Martin Scorsese, David Fincher, someone along those lines? No, it's Clint Eastwood. 2 Oscar-winning performances, Sean Penn and Tim Robbins. He follows that with $1 Million Baby, which has 2 more Oscar-winning performances, Morgan Freeman and Hilary Swank, and wins Best Picture and Best Director. And he follows that with 2 films about the Battle of Iwo Jima, one in English, one in Japanese, both fine. The Japanese one, I think, is the better. And he does that streak in his 70s. Go look and see what Hitchcock and Ford and William Wyler and those cats were doing in their 70s. They were whittling. They were not making films on 3 continents in 2 languages for 2 studios.
I love that story that you tell of him filming Flags of Our Fathers and saying to we'll just do another shot here for the other film. Don't bother with the scene number or anything. Just write down the other film.
And the crew is saying, what other film? Like they had no idea. They were shooting in Iceland, which has beaches that resemble the beaches at Iwo Jima, and he wanted the reverse shots. So we, in the American version, we are the guys charging the beach, but in the Japanese version, we're shooting those guys. And what's amazing, it points out the great story that Hitchcock used to tell about Psycho, when Norman Bates has murdered Marion Crane and hidden her in her car, and he's going to drive the car and bury it in the swamp. There's a moment where it stops sinking, and the audience thinks, oh no, the murderer is not going to get away with it because the car's not sinking. And it's just a human reaction. And it's the same in Letters from Iwo Jima. We have been on the side of the soldiers being gunned down on the beach, and then we watch the second movie, and we are the guys sticking our machine guns out of these bunkers, and we are thinking, get the bastards. And 1 movie ago we were thinking, please don't shoot them. But it's the same scene.
Absolutely brilliant. I totally agree. I always think that works as well in Inglourious Bastards when they're showing the film in the cinema, and it's a Nazi hero who's the sniper, and it looks like a scene from Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
And you're sort of like, oh no, well, of course, the Nazis had their if they'd won, they would have had their version of Saving Private Ryan, yes.
Yeah, Private Ryan gets it in the final.
Yeah, exactly. Killing Private Ryan, it would have been called.
Catching.
Achtung by Private Ryan. In terms of some of the other things that interweave this story of filmmaking, and I think it's good that our conversation is the major part of it is concentrated on the art and the artistry, and rather than sort of the gossip and the rather more sordid sort of side of things. But let's talk a little bit about the private life. And I think this weaves in a little bit with the politics, because he's always been a libertarian. He's never really been someone who's voiced sort of like, oh, I'll be into family values, he's someone who seems to me to be unsullied by hypocrisy. He might have mistreated some partners. He might not have been entirely fair to some women. but I don't get the feeling that he's ever sort of put himself out there as being this perfect image. And in fact, in some of his films, like Tightrope, for instance, he very much plays with a very ambiguous sexual identity. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. What do you think?
He was married in 1953. He was nobody. He hadn't even begun acting school. And Maggie Johnson, his first wife, they were married for 30 years. And during that time, he had at least 3 children by 2 women unknown to Maggie. I think that the pair were, as the marriage was unraveling, if not the divorce papers signed. But there was a child born in the early 60s when he was on Rawhide, whom he acknowledged to the mother and to the child, but Maggie seems not to have known about. It's hard to say. And he gave interviews consistently talking about, I'm independent, I'm a lone wolf, Maggie has to know that about me, I do as I please. And today, it's more common to talk about open relationships and consensual non-monogamy. But I don't know that you could say in the 60s, if you were working for CBS or Universal Pictures, yes, my wife and I have an open marriage. I sleep with who I want, and she's free to do the same. That would have been the end. He comported himself along those lines. He had a long-term relationship with the mother of Kimber, who was born in 1960, 61-ish. He had a long-term relationship with Sandra Locke, which was very public. They were on the cover of People magazine and made a bunch of movies together, at first denying that they had a relationship. And then, their relationship and the end of their relationship coincided with the end of his marriage to Maggie. He had a second marriage in the 90s and aughts. It went till 2012 or so. It's not clear that he practiced monogamy consistently in that marriage. And for the most part, he was clear to his partners. This is who I am. This is what you'll get from me. And if he sang about monogamy, as Sandra Locke reports in her memoir that he did, she made me monogamous, he used to sing. It didn't last for long. And even, we're human. Even knowing that's the case, one attaches, one, comes to love the partner. And then the partner says, I'm pretty much done here. And that sucks. Mm-hmm. And I say in the introduction to the book, I'm glad I was not a woman in his life. But that's not my job as a biographer.
Right.
And I think it's to be fair, to lay it out, to say, he seems to indicate in these interviews where he's talking about his freedom that Maggie, for instance, has the same freedom. There are no reports of her availing herself of liberties, or, she was a mother of 2 and a homemaker. So, that doesn't really get you on the dating apps.
Yeah.
It's like, so, and then of course the business with Sandra Locke ended in such an ugly fashion. He changed the locks on the home that she largely built for them to share. He bought it, but she built it. He evicted her basically and had her things put in storage, and she never saw one of her pets again. Again, these are by her account in her published memoir, and she has passed. And Clint has denied, he made decisions about her reproductive rights, reproductive health for her, abortions, and a tubal ligation. He denied that, but those charges were made in court documents at the time of their palimony suit. And the palimony suit was settled in part through what was later found to be fraud, in which Warner Brothers and Clint conspired to give her money to leave Clint be and make movies at Warner Brothers that Warner Brothers had no intention ever of making. And it turned out that Warner Brothers wasn't spending a penny. It was Clint's money being funneled through Warner Brothers as a budget item on Unforgiven and then another film. So, a truly ugly scene that there is no expiation for. And, I'm not here. I'm not Richard Schickel. I'm not here to tell you, Schickel actually says things in the book about this case that I'm describing that seem to think, well, the lawyers forced him to do this. Yeah, you try and force Clint Eastwood to do something he doesn't want to do, pal. I'd like to watch that. I'm buying a ticket, So it's hard to look at that and say, yeah, this guy isn't patriarchal and sexist and all these things. But he's born in 1930. He was raised in that. I think there are ways in which he has evolved, but I also think there's ways in which he's had his way no matter what. And he's going to do that stuff. I don't know if he does it in his 90s, but he did it for a long time. And I find no reason to whitewash it. It's part of who he is. It's public knowledge. There are legal documents. There are things he says about it in direct quotes. I learned on the Jerry Lewis book, if there's going to be something really awful in the pages about the person, quote them saying it. What are you going to do? Sue me for quoting you? Go right ahead. I could use the publicity. Thank you.
Well, Patrick McGilligan had a lot of trouble with Clint suing him. Have you had any feedback?
I have not had any feedback. It's early days. The book's only been out 3 weeks. I know the line where these things can be done, where you can be sued. McGilligan's book, McGilligan had some very poor fortune. An old friend, a childhood friend of Clint's, who spoke with McGilligan and reported a number of unsavory things on a tape recording, then signed an affidavit saying, I didn't say those things, and allowing Clint to sue the biographer. And the lawsuit was dropped. There was no settlement paid. Clint's camp demanded things of McGilligan, never followed up on the demands. So, but I think I know, I wrote about Robert De Niro. I wrote about Sinatra when he was alive. He died 4 weeks after that book came out. So, I learned on Jerry Lewis where that line is and how often you can dance right up to it before the ground beneath you starts to crumble and you fall. And I think the main thing is to be fair. As I said earlier, why would you let someone in your head for years if you hated them? I can hate something that someone did, and if that's the preponderance of what they're about, then I'm not going to write about them. There are actors I would love to write a book about, except for the fact that the son of a bitch would be, in my waking thoughts for years, and I don't want that.
Yeah, I just interviewed Roger Lewis, who wrote the book about the life and death of Peter Sellers, and his
great book,
unbelievable book. And that's kind of took him 5 years to write that book, and it kind of ended up being about him going crazy writing the book.
And my Jerry Lewis experience was along those lines, and it's like, am I going to do that again? No. So the question is to find someone. I'm currently writing, talk about being fortunate and blessed. I am writing a biography of David Lynch. Wow. David Lynch is someone who I wake up every day and I look at stuff and I find a clip or a quote that just delights me. And David Lynch had a complex personal life, 4 wives, 1 child with each wife, weird breakups. But I think in Lynch's case, people are like, I'm involved now with a brilliant creative artist, like on the level of Picasso. And this is not going to go the way I imagined my marriage would go, but I'm in it for as long as we're viable together. And everyone I've spoken to, and it's a much more reported book in that sense than the Clint book, everyone I've spoken to has been like, I had the best time. This guy was amazing. I saw things I couldn't believe. So again, I'm lucky to find someone who's like, I've written a book about Fellini. I've written a book about Paul Newman. These are sort of heroes of mine who I can look at and say, yeah, I'll wake up every morning and think about that dude.
Well, that's what I love about your book is I think that there really is, you're not hagiographic about the character, about Clint himself, and similarly, your reading of the films are very, as we've already heard in this conversation, there are films that you go, okay, this isn't great. Firefox is clunky. The British like Where Eagles Dare. I'm a bit baffled by that, love, and so on and so forth. So it's not, and that makes it so much more convincing and serious when you come to the great works, or even when you come to the works which might not be considered great, but as as you said, with A Perfect World, which I remember seeing at the cinema and loving. But you feel, okay, this is a bit underrated. We need to pump this one up a bit.
Yeah, I think that there is real discovery, and it's discovery about the person and discovery about the work. I've the first press this book got in People magazine and the New York Post was scandalous new book reveals Clint's history of cheating and mistresses and I'm thinking, first of all, you bastards reported these stories in real time. Like,
Yeah.
if you go and look at the footnotes, it's citing the New York Post and People magazine. So just because you have no institutional memory doesn't make me a mudraker. But secondly, the day after those headlines came up, we had a lot of interview requests, and one of them was from Fox News, from their website, not from the TV network. And I did the interview with the young woman. The reporter, I'm sorry, calling her young woman is wrong-minded. She's a reporter, and she wrote a good piece of journalism. But the question she had, she was very polite, and every other question was about his affairs or his sex life. And the intervening questions were very generic. Why is he an icon? What surprised you when you did your research? And at the end she said, is there anything you'd like to talk about that we haven't discussed? And I said, yes. He's a director and film and actor of some note with a long career in Hollywood. You haven't asked me about a single movie.
Yeah.
And she wrote 1,500 words. I mean, it's a long piece. It's online, and like I say, it's good reporting, but it's such a narrow view of the guy.
Yeah.
And you can have the films of Clint Eastwood, or you can have the sex life of Clint Eastwood. Those are separate books, but my book is about the man and the movies.
Did you have any contact with Clint, either for the book or previously in journalism?
No. I worked at the Oregonian, and every time Clint released a movie, I started at the Oregonian just after Unforgiven. So literally every time a Clint Eastwood movie was on the release radar, I would put in a request to Warner Brothers. I'd like to interview Clint Eastwood. I never got to talk with him. I talked with several of his actors over the years. They would say, no, Clint's not available, but James Woods, who's in 3 scenes of this movie, he's available. Okay, fine, I'll talk to him. And then Mount Paso and Clint's people had no response to my queries for this book. I think Clint sat with Richard Schickel in 1995 at age 65 and thought, well, I'll get this over with and tell my life story. And he still hadn't made one of his Oscar-winning films, his most commercially successful film, American Sniper, or these remarkable late life movies, Cry Macho, The Mule, Gran Torino, where he's playing. We've never seen someone direct themselves at that age, nowhere on earth. I mean, there may be a Japanese or South American filmmaker unknown to me who's done this, but this is a global icon directing himself in stories about advanced age. It's just amazing. There's no way to prove these things. I know Manuel de Oliveira, the Portuguese director, directed.
I was just about to mention that.
He directed into his hundreds, but he wasn't starring in his own movies, and they were modest little films. They were appropriate. This is not to characterize them as art. But Clint is doing this for Warner Brothers. Clint is working with $60 million budgets. It's just a different ball game, It's Champions League versus local football. I love local football, but I don't confuse it with the FIFA Club World Cup.
And long may it continue. Hopefully, there'll be an updated version of the book with an extra couple of chapters to cover his.
I don't know about chapters. A couple of pages. When I was finishing work on Paul Newman, Newman died in September 2008, and my book was due at the publisher in November of 2008. And Newman's illness had been made public. There were pictures of him clearly, felled by something in wheelchairs and looking just gaunt, and he was in his 80s. And so when he died, that weekend, he died, I believe, on a Thursday, or his death was announced on a Thursday morning. Every town in the United States where he had made a movie, opened a camp for terminally ill children, run an auto race, gone on vacation with his family. There were stories. And I probably read 400 newspaper articles that weekend and found another 25 people to interview. And it added maybe 10,000 words to the book. In Clint's case, I could conceivably fatten up previous chapters, but how many pages could a 95-year-old provide me? He could prove me wrong. His mom lived to be 97 and was active until pretty much the last months of her life. His dad, on the other hand, died when he was about 60 of a heart attack. So, in some sense, in this sort of the son's superseding the father's, he's already lived one and a half of his father's lifespan. And in another, his mom, Clint started eating health food in the 50s. I found these hilarious articles that said he eats yogurt in quote marks and wheat bread in quote marks. It's like these exotic foods. And he had to travel from his home in Burbank near Universal Studios to the hippie neighborhood in Venice, California to go to a health food store to find things like alfalfa sprouts, and he has practiced transcendental meditation every day, often twice a day since the mid 70s, which he has in common with David Lynch. And he's just taking care of the vessel of his body. So if he makes another movie or two, I wouldn't be surprised, but I would be very surprised if Mariner Books came and said, we want a new edition. Jerry Lewis lived 20 odd years after my book, and the people were like, no, thanks, we're good.
Yeah, fair enough. I was actually talking to Patrick McGilligan, who's been on a couple of episodes, and he said, lately for Woody Allen, and he said once you've done a book, it's kind of out in the rearview mirror. You don't want to have to go back to it and revise it or anything. You're on to the next thing.
Yeah, just like Clint is on to the next movie. When I was working on Jerry, I was miserable. I mean, my interactions with him were horrible. I've had people quote me back horrible things Jerry said to me. They're all in the there's an afterword in the book about my interactions with him. I once went up to Harry Shearer at the Sundance Film Festival. I had interviewed him for the book because he knew Jerry when he was just starting out in Hollywood. And I introduced myself and he touches someone on the shoulder. He says, "Oh, honey, here's the guy Jerry Lewis yelled at on the boat." This is a decade later. And when I was working on that book, I remember saying out loud to my then wife, the day this guy dies, my name is going to be in the paper. And the day I die, his name is going to be in the paper. And I'm 1 for 1 on that. Sure enough, the day he died, like I was in the New York Times, all the major papers were quoting the book or talking about, his relationship, his strained relationship to his biographer. But God. It's a nice thing too, because years go by and someone will say, I read Rat Pack Confidential on the airplane when I took my trip to Italy, or someone will, come up and say, this is something that happened to me. A German film company was doing something for Robert De Niro's 80th birthday. And it was about 10 years after my De Niro book had come out. And I said, well, I'm not planning on being in Germany or even on the East Coast. And they said, well, we'll fly you to New York and put you up and give you, some money for your trouble. And I was like, great, honey, we're going to New York. And while we were in New York, my son and his wife showed us the sonogram and told us that we would be grandparents. And it was like, wow, I would not be here if it wasn't for Robert De Niro. So, that they get stuck to you sometimes in a good way.
Yeah, the gifts keep on giving in that sense. That's a beautiful story. I love that. And one final question, Shawn. I always ask my guests for a recommended film book, and I always sort of don't give them this beforehand so that I can get a reaction. So have you got a recommended film book that you'd like to give our listeners?
My favorite film biography is Scott Berg's book, Goldwyn. about Samuel Goldwyn. When I started writing about Jerry Lewis, I had two books in mind that were sort of exemplary biographies. One was Richard Ellman's biography of James Joyce, which I had read as a graduate student, and then the Scott Berg book on Goldwyn, where he does a thing that I've tried to do. I did not do in the Clint book, but I did it in De Niro and Lewis and Newman, where you stop the book for a minute and say, okay, so here's who he is as of this date. Here's what his daily life is like. His wife cooks this type of food. He's got these number of children running around the house. He's made these movies and he might feel this way. And just this wonderful previously on Hill Street Blues, that moment where you're just sort of catching up with the story. And I think of them as these little meta chapters. And I first saw that done in Berg's Goldwyn book. But if I had to choose a book about sort of more than that, I love a book called An Empire of Their Own by Neil Gabler or Gabler. I don't know how he pronounces it. And it's a history of the Jewish moguls who created Hollywood, all but the Disney studio. Every studio that you and I can name from the classic era had Jewish founders and Jewish immigrant founders. And they had to hide their Jewish identity because they were not only a minority, they weren't Christian, they were, dirty foreigners. I mean, that hasn't changed. And it's just brilliant in showing how, like, each of their different personalities, even though they were working in parallel, they did something different. The Warner Brothers happened to have grown up with social conscience, and their studio made films like that. Adolf Zukor, who founded Paramount, worked in the glove business, and he had a high-end clientele. So Paramount movies always had a certain polish and aspirational look to them. Louis Mayer kind of created the American dream of the white picket fence and the Love Finds Andy Hardy movie, and each of them reflects who they were personally. And I've written biographies, but I've also written books about what I think of as scenes. So Rat Pack Confidential, Ready, Steady, Go, about swinging London of the 60s. And by the way, it was Terence Stamp's 87th birthday yesterday. Much respect. And
the original
Dolce Vita Confidential. Yeah. Those books are about scenes where a culture starts clicking on multiple fronts. So photography, fashion, cinema, pop music, journalism, poetry, painting, like in those books, like it's all coming together for a brief shining moment in one place. And those books, I think part of the ideal formula for them is that's Neil Gabler, An Empire of Their Own.
Excellent. That's some brilliant suggestions there, and I haven't read that one, so I shall have to order it and put it on my to-read list. Thank you so much, Shawn.
Gabler is top shelf. So is Scott Berg, but those two books in particular.
Thank you so much for joining me, Shawn. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Oh, likewise. Thanks for the invite and for the great interview. I appreciate it.